When I went into the foyer of the pumpkin house, I wasn't sure what I was expecting. After everything I saw in the mausoleum, I figured it would be an easy escalation to full on body horror and monsters. Instead, what I saw resembled any other old home in Autumn County. There was a large, curving stairway in the middle of the room, which led to a second floor with balconies. There were paintings along the walls, mostly filled with paintings of a pale man with a mustache and elaborate red collar, likely Count DeVille himself. The floor was a checkered black and white pattern that reminded me of something out of Lockhart, but it wasn't unheard of to be used in a home in Autumn County. There was an obvious door that led down, likely into the basement, and also a door that led off to the right, not counting the two doors upstairs. Oh, another crossroads. Now I just had to find out what the fifth path was meant to be. The door behind me was locked. I tried to open it just in case, and it was locked. I also tried consulting my compass, but oddly enough, the needle was missing. So I figured the compass wasn't going to be useful here, so I put the compass away and decided to try the door that led down first. When I made it to the door, I realized I wasn't going to make it through the door. The door wasn't a door. It was another painting with common Creole carved into it. That which is above is like to that which is below, and that which is below is like to that which is above, with a tarot card of the magician set into the wood. The magician pointed one hand above and one hand below. I stared at it for a moment before I realized what it was supposed to mean. The phrase was the original phrase that most people shorten to "as above, so below," a phrase associated with the magician. So, if there's no door down here that leads into the basement, maybe there would be one above. This made sense to me, at least. Maybe it could be a warning of something else. Maybe the card was a warning that Count DeVille was a magician in addition to being a vampire. Still, though, I felt like the magician arcana was a clue to understanding this place. I still checked the painted door. There was no keyhole nor cracks for me to use the key on, so I guess I will have to try a different door. Still, as I turned away from the painted door, I became aware of the feeling of being watched. It was like walking in late to a class, and everyone, including the teacher, was staring at you, waiting for you to sit down. Except knowing what I knew about this place, that wasn't simple anxiety. It was my first warning. Count DeVille was coming into this room. I quickly glanced over the room looking for anything that had a rabbit carved into it, but I didn't see anything. There wasn't anywhere I could hide, let alone any places with rabbits on it. As a chill ran down my spine, I noticed a painting that wasn't quite like the others. In it was a painting of a young girl dressed in all black, like she was in mourning, and even wore a widow's veil, so her face was covered. I couldn't see her eyes, but her wide-toothed smile was visible, even beneath her veil, and in her arms was a white rabbit with red eyes. It was my only lead, so with my breath now visible, I ran to the painting and pulled on the frame. Sure enough, it opened and quickly I ducked inside. The door was the painting, and I closed it behind me. A tiny eye hole was in the painting, and, not able to help myself, I peeked through the hole into the foyer. My eye eagerly stared inside to get a glimpse of Count DeVille. The lights in the room dimmed, but they didn't get put out completely. I saw the Count crawl down the wall like a lizard, and I saw his face. His eyes were drained of color, and so was his face. He looked sickly, but the evil inside of him was palpable. He didn't hate, he didn't hunger, he didn't feel vengeance. He would cause suffering because that was his nature, a true evil I haven't seen before. Even the rabid werewolf was better than this. A werewolf was full of anger and hunger, a wild animal that was doing what it was supposed to do. This man was a man who caused pain because that was his nature. He would draw joy from it, the same way you drew joy from doing good in the world. The Count DeVille would sleep well during the day, knowing he made the world a worse place. And now, so much more of what I went through made so much more sense. If he loved his wife at any point, he now only cared about torturing the sexton of the cemetery by sewing the maestro of the mausoleum to his back. He made deals with Robert Romero because they only brought him more suffering, giving away his precious family and animals in exchange for beasts that would turn on him in a moment. The fairgrounds were always moving, trying to escape him, but he offered prizes to have people leave the safety of the fairgrounds, only for him to cause them more pain. All this evil I could see above his bushy mustache, but thankfully the Count didn't find me, and before long he crawled back up the wall, bringing light and warmth back into the foyer. I let out a relieved sigh and pushed on the painting door. Only the door didn't open on my side. The painting was, apparently, one way only. After trying to push it open a few times, I heard an electric buzzing behind me. I turned slowly to see what I thought was a small hidden space, only it was actually a long hallway. The sconces weren't torches, but electric lamps. They buzzed, and I was thankful for the light as I walked down the hallway. I guess this was the fifth path. The hallway continued for about 10 meters before it opened up into another chamber. The electric lamps lit three mosaics in front of me. Each one sat in a recessed niche made to look like a door. The mosaic on my left had a fish in a pond swimming against the current. The mosaic in the middle depicted a wolf with two human infants just underneath it. And the final mosaic on my right was a large moose in a green field. This must be a new puzzle for me to solve before I could get out. I had to figure out which one of these wasn't like the others. I started with the obvious. They were mosaic art made to look like they came from the Julian dynasty of Rome. So, if that was the case, then the fish made sense. Public pools and baths often had mosaics of fish where people bathed and swam. Those made sense and were extremely common within the Republic's territories. The mosaic in the middle may stand out to the layman because it had humans and the other mosaics didn't. Except if you knew the legend about Romulus and Remus, then you knew that the twin brothers were raised by Lupa, and this myth was depicted in every form of art the Romans had. So the mosaic would also be common in the Julian dynasty. So, the only mosaic that didn't fit into the Julian dynasty was the mosaic of the moose. Moose existed almost exclusively on the continent of Vespucci. The Julian dynasty would have no knowledge of that gigantic quadruped. So, why was there a Roman mosaic of that creature here? Unless it wasn't really a recessed niche and actually a real door. I walked up to the mosaic and pressed on it, and it opened without problem. I stepped into the doorway and continued down the hallway. It didn't take long before it turned into a stairway heading up. I continued up the stairs until it turned into three different recessed niches with different art inside of it. The painting on the left was a wood print made to look like it was from the Edo period of Nippon. It depicted a giant skeleton peering down on a samurai with a princess in pink off to the left of the painting. The painting in the middle depicted a large serpentine dragon with large eyes and open-toothed smile, and reached out to the front with 5 claws on its hand. The painting on the right showed a woman with long dark hair with the body of a snake. An extension of the puzzle from earlier, it seemed. So I looked over the Edo period paintings. They all looked like they were from the right era. They all depicted creatures from the lore. I didn't have all of the paintings in the world memorized, so I had to base it off what felt wrong. I glanced first at the giant skeleton, then the dragon, then the Nuraona, snake woman, before I realized what it was. I checked the dragon again, and I had my answer. This dragon had 5 claws on its hand. Dragons in that area of the world only had 3 toes on each foot. It was a point that was repeated again and again and again in my grandmother's lessons, and now it was coming in handy. I stepped up to the dragon door and opened it. Now down another hallway, I walked up the gentle slope until I made my way down to the third and final chamber. If it followed the format of most challenges, the third challenge would be the final challenge. But conversely, it would also be the most challenging. The doors here were modern paintings made to look hyper-realistic. It made it look like the figures before me would walk off the painting, if they so choose. The doorway on the left depicted a tall, black man with a carved wooden cane with a raven on it. He had a tall top hat and a sharp suit on it, with his face painted to resemble a skeleton. His eyes seemed to follow me as I looked at the other paintings. The middle painting had a white man, also dressed in a suit, and a hand hidden behind his back, which mostly, but not completely, concealed a whip. He also carried a bottle of what was clearly rum in his hand. The painting on the right depicted a tall, black woman with a snake curled around her shoulders, head in one hand and her other hand holding a mirror. It took me a few minutes of looking them over before I recognized who they were supposed to represent. The man on the left was Baron Samdi, the man in the middle was Din Clinson, and the woman on the far right was La Serene. They were all Loa, and now I had to figure out which path was the right path to go down. The most obvious difference was Dinclinson. He was one of the few Loas who were depicted as white, but that didn't feel right for the final challenge. Everything else required knowledge of either the history or the culture of the art. I felt like that was relevant here also. Dinclinson was a thief and a cruel man who enslaved others, often torturing and causing pain, so I wanted to stay away from him, if I could. La Serene had both positive and negative connotations, being a Loa that would watch over rivers and boats, but she would also drown unsuspecting men and children who got too close. That left Baron Samdi. He was known as being a bit of a trickster, but he also controlled the paths between the living and dead, sometimes keeping people from dying even if they were cursed by refusing to dig their graves. But he would also send back the dead in the form of zombies, but he was usually honored at the crossroads of cemeteries with a special Baron's Cross. Wait, crossroads? That kept with the ongoing theme of everything I went through so far. This had to be the right way. I stood at the door ready to push at the painting when I paused. This seemed right, but now I was second guessing myself. Any argument I could make about Baron Samdi could just as easily be applied to the other paintings. Every figure before me had traits in common with at least one other painting. No one painting was completely different. All I could do was have confidence in myself. I pushed on the door and stepped into the darkness. It took only a moment, but the electric lights came on, and I was in a room that looked like it was made for a little girl. A dollhouse could be seen in the corner, and the open closet held many dresses. As for the doorway I stepped through, It clicked behind me. It showed a painting of a sunset, and despite me pulling on it, it didn't dare move. Once again, I was in a place where the Count could find me. I looked around and I couldn't find any rabbits carved anywhere, so I figured staying here was a bad idea. I went to the door and, sure enough, it was unlocked. I opened it and it showed a hallway. There were paintings along the walls of the same tree. At first, I thought it was an apple tree, but apple trees don't grow apples of different colors alongside roses of different colors. A beautiful painting, for sure, and a symbolic one because roses and apples were in the same family. But to be fair, the rose family is massive and included a lot of foods that people would eat that taste almost nothing alike. However, it is usually considered bad custom to tell others that the raspberries and almonds they were eating were technically roses. However, there were no other doors as far as I could see, so I started my walk down the hallway. After 10 minutes of walking, I made the decision that the spaces inside of the pumpkin house were also pretty inconsistent. The hallway didn't have any changes, at least at first, but then I noticed that the paintings of the trees were changing. At first, I thought they were moving because the leaves were changing position, but as I continued, the paintings grew more and more disturbing. The leaves and fruits all fell to the ground and decayed. The branches grew sparser and sparser, and soon all that was left was a rotten stump. I hoped the paintings would end there, but they continued with the hallway. Soon even the stump decayed and revealed what was beneath the stump. Not even grass remained in the painting by that point. Underneath the stump was revealed a breastplate with a sword stabbed through the heater in the middle of the chest. A golden heater that had a tree of roses and apples. And still, even that metal rusted and degraded, soon joining the dirt as rust and dust. And then the sun in the painting grew dimmer and dimmer. The sun's position remained the same, but it was clearly meant to indicate that the life on the planet had died a long time ago, but now it was time for the sun to join it. I watched as the sun dimmed and darkened, and I was now fascinated by the paintings. I watched as the sun faded, and the end of the hallway was now in sight. At the end of the hallway was a small door, one I would have to crawl through, and over it, the final painting that depicted a dark sky with barely a few stars to lighten the dark earth, and a silver crescent moon where the sun once was. Wait, that didn't make any sense. If the sun was supposed to be dead, the moon would not be able to reflect any sunlight. I looked at the moon a bit closer. It was silvery and shiny, and it looked like it was on top of the painting, a smooth texture over the bumpy oil painting. So, carefully, I grabbed the coin-sized crescent and pulled it. Sure enough, it was silver, and it wasn't actually a part of the painting. This must have been part of the silver hidden throughout the house by the little girl. I did notice when I removed the crescent, more stars were visible, and the painting looked a lot brighter, like I helped bring more light to it. And I also noticed that in the dirt, a very tiny sapling growing in the darkness. Even after the death of the sun, life still lived, even after all of that death and decay. Though I guess even decay was its own form of life. Microscopic life consuming, breeding, and growing. But it's easy to just see it as the end of one life, not the beginning of a new one. I kept that thought with me while I opened the short door and started to crawl through. This short hallway resembled the hallway I just walked through, only a lot smaller. There was even a tiny red carpet in the middle of the small paintings on the walls. The paintings weren't of a tree, though. They were of a cast iron gate that guarded a desert. An odd choice for a painting, but I felt like it had a connection to the painting before, though what the tree meant eluded me. I guess it could be the tree of knowledge, the tree of life, or even the evolution tree. Or maybe the tree was just a tree, but the cast iron gate to the desert made me think it was meant to keep something out, something away from that tree. I continued crawling down the short tunnel, but thankfully it wasn't nearly as long as the last hallway, just 5 meters before it opened into a new room. I crawled through the door and stood up when I realized what room I was inside. I was inside a large library with 2 stories. Each shelf was full of books. The walls were red and gold with little filigree made to resemble rose thorns. Not rose petals, not even rose flowers, but rose thorns and stems. The symbolism there wasn't lost on me. There's good in the world and bad in the world. They aren't mutually exclusive. Roses were a great example of it. The flowers were beautiful and smelled pleasant, bringing great joy to the world. But the thorns were sharp and painful, a reminder not to grab roses without protection. But by removing the flowers and just leaving the thorns behind, the Count was telling me that he didn't want beauty in the world, only pain, and he wouldn't stand for any reminder of joy within his view. The books were interesting, though. The titles were organized alphabetically rather than by subject, compared to other libraries. Most libraries, including those in the 7 cities, used the decimal system that organized subjects via number, allowing readers to find the books they were looking for. An alphabetical system by author's name wasn't unheard of, especially for fiction books, but an alphabetical system by book name was almost never used in professional libraries. Except for children's books, maybe, but quite a few of these books were not for children. I found the Atlas of Apocalypse, the Atlas of Armageddon, the books of Azathoth and Idon, the Compendium of Crises, the Explorer's Encyclopedia, the Gospel of Eve, and even the Portfolio of Paths, which would supposedly open any path anywhere in Altus, but would also open a path within your mind that would allow entities to enter. I half expected to find the Necronomicon, but sadly, that book was clearly checked out. And these earnest esoterica were alongside fantastical fictions, such as children's and household tales, the Epic of Gilgamesh, Homer's Odyssey, Journey to the West, and The Tale of Genji. All certainly fascinating, and I could spend days going through all of these books. I wish my school actually stocked interesting books. Still, though, I could see a way up to the stairway that led to a door above. Clearly, my way out, though it seemed like no challenge nor puzzle. So, what was my challenge? I wish I hadn't thought of that question because the hairs on the back of my neck were raised and I felt like I was being watched. Count DeVille was aware of my presence and he was coming to investigate. I cast my eyes around the room to try and find a rabbit anywhere. There were no paintings, no sculptures, and no furniture around the entire library. Just books and shelves. I couldn't go through them all to find one that would happen to have a rabbit. Think, what is the most likely book to have a rabbit on the cover or maybe even on the spine? Biology book. Maybe a book about rabbits. Casting my eyes through the R's for rabbits showed me no books about rabbits. Nothing under L for lagomorphs, and even checking B for bunnies yielded me nothing. I could see my breath, and my shivers got worse as the lights upstairs dimmed. He was about to be in the room, and I still didn't have a rabbit. And I was close to the A's and B's. I had one chance left. What books here would have a rabbit? Then it hit me. A favorite book I used to love reading when I was younger. Even now, I still had a copy of it in my room. It was written by an old Albion mathematician who was more well known for puzzles, platitudes, photos, and poems than his prose, but his book was always my favorite. And sure enough, I could see the book near the beginning of the A's, written by Charles Dodgson, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. I had a feeling the young girl would have loved that book too, and nearly every edition I had ever seen had a white rabbit on the spine. And sure enough, this one did as well. I pulled on the book and the shelf clicked, offering a small nook for me to hide in. Sure enough, I rushed inside and closed the door as quietly as I could while still trying to close it quickly. By then, the library was pitched completely into darkness, and the small electric lamp in the nook was dim. Now, alone in the nook, I sat down and hugged my knees to my chest. The Count was so close. I thought I could hear his breathing in my ear. I hugged my knees tight, barely breathing, while the electric lantern above me flickered and dimmed for nearly a minute. I was certain Count DeVille was searching for me. He must know by now to look for the rabbits, and surely he would find it. Even if he wasn't a reader, he could just look over every book in the library before he found it. But after that minute, the electric lantern stopped flickering, and after another 2 minutes, it brightened, and I felt like I could breathe freely again. The Count must have moved on, but still I wanted to stay in this space for a while. Now, with a brighter light, I looked over the room I was in. It was clearly built for a young girl. There was a small blue rug, and the walls were colored over in colored wax. At first, I thought it was the story of Alice's adventures in Wonderland. It started with a little girl following a white rabbit down a hole. She entered a world that was full of large flowers and berries. It depicted the young girl drinking tea with other animals. But oddly enough, the Mad Hatter was missing. And then the young girl returned to the rabbit hole and returned to her world. And this is where the colored wax got a lot darker. The world the little girl returned to was full of smoke and fire. The people had nothing to eat, and many died. The girl begged them and eventually led them to the rabbit's hole. And then the people she was with joined her in Wonderland. I stared at the colored wax, wondering the meaning, and under the light of the electric lantern, it flickered, and for a moment, just a moment, I felt like I was in a cold cave and not a warm nook. And the colored wax was now cave painting showing the same story. The story of a little girl who found a brand new wonderland, and then saw her people dying. So she took them to Wonderland. But then what? Did they live happily? Did they ever return to the world? Did they die there? Were they still there? And what world was that? It almost reminded me of Lockhart, but even in the few books I got on Altus, Lockhart was only ever mentioned in passing, so I couldn't be sure of anything, except that the architecture often looped onto itself, and they had a goddess that often lived among them. The lantern stopped flickering again, and I returned to the nook. Now, a lot calmer, having examined the colored wax, I pressed on the handle of the shelf and it moved open with no trouble. I peeked into the library and it was back to normal. So I left the nook and closed it behind me. I had to make it upstairs without distraction. Distractions were what allowed him to find me. The door opened with ease and it led to a very small room, barely the size of a closet, that had a ladder leading up into the darkness. Unless I missed my guess, that was supposed to be the attic. But then again, I already went upstairs about three, maybe four times by now, so who knows how many floors were in this two-story house. I climbed the ladder into the darkness, and when I climbed into the darkness, the lights came on, revealing a mirror maze I climbed into. The ladder stopped a meter from the ceiling, but before I had a chance to secure my feet to the ground, something unexpected happened. It felt like the whole world turned itself upside down. Gravity was no longer pulling me down into the library. It was now pulling me up into the mirror maze. I tried to grab on tight to the rung, but with my feet now dangling into the mirror maze, it was only a second before I dropped into the mirror maze. Thankfully, the fall didn't hurt, but the ladder did retract into the new ceiling, and the mirror slid into its place, leaving me in an endless reflected maze. The walls, ceiling, and floor were all mirrored, reflecting myself and my reflections endlessly. The seams where the mirrors met was where the light came from. Clearly, I was supposed to see all of the mirrors clearly, and now I ran into a new problem. How do I find the myself mirror? It could be any of these mirrors, and I would have no way of knowing. It would just look like another mirror. Still, I decided to keep moving. Wherever it was, I had to trust that it would be possible to be found, especially if my sister found it. So I put my hand on the right wall and I began to walk down the mirrored hallway. I saw myself from every angle. If I glanced down, my reflection glanced back at me, just as nervous as I felt. If I peeked to my right, I saw her peeking right back. Spying to my left revealed only a young girl spying right back. And desperate looks up only showed me a desperate soul looking right back. So I tried to focus on the light strips that led me deeper and deeper into the mirror maze. After a while, I noticed something new. A distant light that looked like it led to a tiled room. It was different, and I started to run towards it, only to run straight into plate glass. I fell to the ground and cursed in my own mind. Ah, Tavit, that hurt. I looked at where the glass was. Of course, plate glass in a mirror maze. It would make clear paths less likely to be taken. Still, though, now I was aware of where it was. Maybe I could use it. Every mirror was the same shape and size, about 3 meters squared, and so was the plate glass in front of me. And I could count the amount of mirror panels in front of me that led to the apparent exit, in a maze that used a consistent unit of measure laid out exactly like a grid. My mind made that final connection, and my natural weakness with spatial awareness pivoted into my strength with grids and graphs. I counted the panels in front of me. There were 20 panels in front of me before it led to the apparent exit. So that would be my exit, and for simplicity's sake, I would refer to that point as 20, 0. 20 on the x-axis and 0 on the y-axis. And the point I was standing on right now would be point 0, 0. So, when I made a left, the only direction I could make, I would immediately be on point 1, 0. and as long as I kept track of which axis was which and what number I was on, I would be able to find out where point 20 was. And if the mirror maze was a liminal space, similar to the Crooked Cemetery, that would make it more true, not less. Liminal spaces may be endless, but they kept a consistent unit of measure. Whether the maze was 20 by 20, 200 by 200, 2000 by 2000, or even 2 billion by 2 billion, the point 20 would always remain consistent. It was solvable, and I was going to solve it. I had a key in my mind, and as I made my turn and made my way down the path. For a while, it felt like the path was trying to fool me. It kept twisting on itself. More than a few right turns only led back to the same crossroads, leaving me only one way to go. It was clever and would have fooled me if I wasn't keeping track of where I was in the grid. I kept counting, and around point 13.5, I felt a shiver roll down my back, and my breath became visible. I didn't catch the first sign of being watched because I already felt watched in the maze. Count DeVille was approaching, and I haven't seen a single rabbit carving or drawing this entire time in this liminal labyrinth. Now, in a rush, I started to run and counted in my head, as I ran, and my breath struggled to keep up. Even as I got closer, every wrong turn, dead end, and double back cost me precious seconds as the lights dimmed. It was near point 1512 that I saw him in person for the first time. I turned right and nearly ran into him. The Count stood on the mirrored floor, and none of them reflected neither him nor his clothing. He smiled, and his fangs were visible beneath his mustache as he laughed, only to vanish into the darkness. The lights stayed dim, but they were strong enough for me to see where I was going. I was where Count DeVille had the most advantage. He knew the space better than me. The mirrors didn't reflect him like they did me, so he could be anywhere, and I wouldn't be able to see where he was coming from, not to mention every power he had at his disposal. The only reason he vanished into the darkness was because he was playing with me. He knew he already had me. He could afford to take his time. I couldn't. My only advantage was I knew where the exit was going to be, so I had to move quickly, like a mouse in a cobra nest, and hope that I could escape them. I pounded down the hallway where the Count stood only a moment ago, hand on the wall just ahead of me, hoping to avoid another plate glass trap. Around point 17.4, I could hear breathing in my ear and feel cold breath on my neck. When I turned around to see where it was coming from, I couldn't see him, but I could see that the lights behind me were all going out. If I focused enough in the darkness, I could see a figure follow me. He walked without rush and without urgency, but despite that, he kept up with me, walking while I was running as fast as I could. But I knew I was going to make it. 4 more panels forward, and I would make a left turn, and I would be home free. At the final crossroads, I turned left, and the bright light was so close. I could count the individual tiles, and it was just a few steps away. I poured everything I could into those final few meters. My arms pumped, my chest burned, and my legs felt heavy. But I still pushed myself forward. I was going to make it. I faced every other challenge in the labyrinth, and I was going to make my way through this one too. Victory in my mouth, I leapt towards the room, only to feel a strong hand grab my leg and pull me back. I slammed into the reflective floor. My fingers dragged across the tile as Count DeVille pulled me towards him. He stood in near absolute darkness and dangled me upside down, nearly nose to nose with him, while his hungry eyes watched my neck. You feel your heart burning? Can you feel the struggle within? The fear within me is beyond anything your soul can muster. You cannot kill me in any way that matters, he asked in his dark voice. After everything I did to the best I could, and he caught me mere centimeters from the finish line. There had to be a way past him, something, anything. But as tears streamed down my desperate face, I realized something. I wasn't scared of him. After everything, he was absolutely terrifying, and yet I wasn't scared of him. Not anymore. My fear turned to determination, and like earlier with my grid, my mind clicked into place and ran efficiently once again. I remembered a piece of his backstory, and I remembered what was in my pocket. I reached into my pocket and grabbed the silver crescent moon from the painting. I thrust it into his face, and he screamed as the steam rose from his face, and he dropped me. Now, on the ground, I ran forward into the light, leaving Count DeVille screaming, steaming, and stewing in the darkness. The room was small, maybe 2 meters cubed. The myself mirror sat over a sink like it belonged in a bathroom. There were even a few lotion bottles, but what I was concerned about was myself in the mirror. I looked at myself, and despite being tired, I couldn't stop smiling. And I watched for a moment as the figure in the reflection morphed and changed. But then it split into two forms, and my smile disappeared when I saw the two figures before me. Purple light stood behind them where the two women stood. They both stood straight and proud, something I never thought I would be able to do. One woman had short hair cut almost to her head. She wore a jean jacket that had a red circle with a golden crown. She radiated regality and power, the way my father used to be able to do, but she had even more of it. She looked like she'd never had a single doubt her entire life, and she was able to get everyone to listen to her. I felt like I couldn't even convince myself that I was all right. How would I ever grow up to be that confident? The woman next to her was different, yet similar. She had long hair and a rubber band in her hair. She had a white blouse and a black pencil skirt. She was just as professional as her twin, but her confidence radiated differently. Her eyes and smile were so kind. She looked like she could handle every problem in the world and would do so with a smile on her face. She reminded me of my mother when I had problems in my life, but her eyes were even kinder and her smile even sweeter. I couldn't even get myself to smile. How would I ever grow up to be that happy? I felt tears come to my eyes as years of pain came forth. After what happened with my brother and my parents choosing their dead doppelganger son over their living daughter, my grandmother taking over my life, all the wonder of the world squeezed and drained from me. There were days where even breathing felt like that was all I could do. I couldn't even visualize a future for myself just yesterday. And now here I was looking at two different futures where I wouldn't just be happy, but be someone worth admiring. It was all overwhelming. I now saw myself as I was, a tired, beaten down girl crying between them. I watched as they both laid a hand on my shoulders, and I felt their hands on my shoulder, just for a moment, until I realized the hands on my shoulders belonged to Adansi, and they're not different futures. They're both you in the same future. The reason why you don't see what path you need to take to get there is because you're already on that path. You've been on that path ever since you stood at the crossroads and chose to go your own way, Adansi said. I brushed the tears out of my eyes, and Eel spoke this time. But now it's time. You've been with us this entire time, and you've never said your name. Say your name. Let yourself know who you are. I stared into the reflection and saw both of my future selves and my present self. I didn't know what eel meant. Of course I knew who I was. But then I realized he wasn't talking about me. He was talking about myself in the mirror.
My name is Marceline Pierce. I am the Red Prince.
Finally giving her a name. That part of me I always knew was inside of me, but I felt scared to address. But now that fear was replaced with determination. The same determination I felt when I shoved the silver crescent in Count DeVille's face. I faced who I was in that moment, in the mirror. In my eyes, I saw the strength reflected in the Red Prince's eyes. Just a trace, but enough to let me know it's there. And in my smile, I saw the happiness reflected in older Marceline's smile. Just a trace, but enough to let me know that happiness was inside of me. Adansi whispered to me, "Your future selves are very proud of you right now. Remember that." I couldn't explain why it brought new tears to my face, but these tears were different from what filled the sink before.